Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning, good evening, depending on the part of the world that you're in, and welcome to this, the 14th FIDIC COVID-19 webinar. Our usual moderator for these events, Nelson Ogunshakin, FIDIC's Chief Executive, is otherwise engaged today, so I'm going to be the moderator for this event. My name's Andy Walker. I am the communications advisor to FIDIC, and I also edit the UK infrastructure sector magazine and website, Infrastructure Intelligence. I think today's event in the series of webinars is quite an important one, actually. Many of the seminars that we've had so far have talked about the prospects for the infrastructure and construction sector in the future. And I think those prospects in many ways will be largely determined on the attitude of clients, investors and developers, what they think about our sector going forward, and the fragility or otherwise of it as we move out of the immediate effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. We've had, once again, a really good registration take-up for this event. And so far, from the 14 events that we've held, the 14 webinars, we've had more than 7,000 attendees joining us online from all the corners of the world. And when you add those to that figure who watched the reruns of the webinars on FIDIC's YouTube channel, then I think it's fair to say that we've probably had over 10,000 people getting involved in the conversation on these very important issues for our industry. So today's event, clients, investors and developers' perspectives on the fragility of the construction and infrastructure sector, I'm sure is going to be a really, really good event. We have 6 speakers who are going to be talking to us over the course of the next 45 minutes to an hour, after which we'll open up the chat and people can actually post their questions to individual speakers or collectively, and I will pick from those questions to keep the discussion going for basically the full 90 minutes of the webinar. I'll apologize in advance if we don't get to all of the questions, because as you can appreciate with the numbers that we've got attending the webinar, then some of those questions we might not be able to answer, but we'll do our level best to answer most of them, and those that we can't answer directly we'll try and signpost in the chat as much as we possibly can. Before I introduce our speakers in turn, just to say that the lineup for today is our president, Bill Howard, who we'll be hearing from in a second. We've got Jason Liu from the Global Infrastructure Facility. We have Solomon Asamoah of the Ghana Infrastructure Investment Fund. We have Rebecca Zofnass, who's a managing partner at the Environmental Financial Consulting Group. Søren Adamsen, the Executive Marketing Director at COWI. And we have Jose Maria Vinales, who is a partner at the international law firm Squire, Patton, Boggs. To kick things off, as we always do on these occasions, we have the president of FIDIC, Bill Howard. Just by way of a brief introduction, for those that don't know him, Bill has a wide experience of the consulting engineering industry through his work at CDM Smith, who are a global consulting and construction company headquartered in Boston in the US. Bill served on the firm's board of directors for 20 years and currently advises them on a strategic basis at the present time. So joining us live from Boston, Massachusetts, over to you, Bill Howard.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you everyone for participating in the webinar today. I will be brief as I usually am for the webinar because we have quite a few speakers and we want to get to them as soon as possible. The first thing I want to do is thank the Secretariat, Nelson, and his very talented group of people for putting these webinars on together successfully. This would be a difficult process under any circumstances, but with people working remotely, putting webinars like this on is extremely challenging, and I'm pleased to say that they've met the challenge very, very well. So thank you very much to Nelson and the Secretariat, and for you, Andy, for filling in for Nelson on relatively short notice. I also would like to thank the speakers for joining us today. As in the past webinars that we've had terrific speakers, subject matter experts, and I know they are extremely busy with their own companies and firms, and on top of that, dealing with the challenges of this pandemic that no one has seen in our lifetime. So I particularly am thankful to them for participating with us and preparing. I also would like to thank the folks who have registered. We have had a very large amount of people registered, as Andy said, and it's pleasing to us that so many folks from, I believe, over 130 countries have been joining us, and it tells us that our initiative of putting those webinars on has been a good idea. We've been dealing with a whole variety of subjects, and this is the 14th one, and it's dealing with infrastructure, perhaps from client investors and developers' viewpoints. And we all know how important infrastructure is to any economic recovery, and we hope that that will be a large piece of the global economic recovery. We also don't want to lose sight of the fact that before this pandemic, there was a serious global infrastructure problem in all sorts of sectors, including the environment. And on top of that, we have climate change and sustainability and the UN goals related to sanitation, et cetera, that all of which have not left us and will remain. On top of that, the pandemic will likely be identifying other infrastructure needs. So very much looking forward to hearing what the folks have to say today. And with that, I'll probably come back at the end and try to summarize some of the subjects that we've talked about. And I'd like to turn it back to Andy now.
Thanks for that, Bill. And as Bill said, we've been absolutely bowled over by the number of people who've been registering for these events, and long may that continue. I'm sure it'll continue with the future events as well. If we move on now to our next speaker, Jason Liu is the head of the Global Infrastructure Facility. The Global Infrastructure Facility is a partnership among governments, multilateral development banks, private sector investors and financiers, and it's designed to provide a new way to collaborate on preparing, structuring and implementing complex projects that no single institution could handle on its own. So I'm sure that Jason will have some interesting observations for us on this issue. Jason, over to you.
Thank you very much, Andy. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here to share all of you from public sector perspectives. And thank you very much for your invitations. I'll just say a few words about the GIF, give you a little bit more background about who we are, what we do, and also a few background in terms of the how we look at it. The government should use infrastructure as economic stimulus measures, and also looking to the lesson learned we see in the past and how we come together in terms of the COVID response from a gift perspective. As Andy mentioned at the beginning, GIF is a multi-donor funded collaboration platform housed at the World Bank. really focusing on the project preparation. The objective in the end is try to mobilize private sector investment and the long-term commercial finance. We work with multilateral development banks such as the World Bank, IFC, African Development Bank, EBRD, EIB, Asia Development Bank of sorts, and the government of emerging market countries, trying to help the government to bring more projects to the market, not only funding the project preparation cost from the feasibility studies, designs to drafting the tendering document, but also provide a technical expertise from our team. We also have a very strong network with the private sector called Advisory Council. FIDIC is one of our advisory partners, as some of you know. We have been in operation for almost 5 years and have supported more than 90 projects by now. All these projects, if we expect them to get to finish lines, we can expect them to mobilize more than $60 billion over time. Crises like this, we try to remind the government, as the government looks to infrastructure as economic stimulus, they need to be careful about the infrastructure, because the infrastructure is always very difficult to get it right. Bill mentioned all kinds of problems that we have seen in the past. The multi-stakeholder involved, environmental social issues, the governance issues. These are a lot of lessons that we have seen from the past crisis. So the government need to be really very careful to balance between the qualities and the speed. Economic impact of infrastructure, of course, is long-lasting, and it can help create a lot of jobs. The benefit is very clear, improve the quality of life for many peoples, but you got to do it right? Construction work, I mentioned, can help create jobs in the short run, but the project is going to be there for 50, 100 years. It's going to have a much longer term impact over the entire project lifespan. So the government need to make sure that they invest in project preparations, the feasibility studies, the design, the risk allocation, and the market soundings. The COVID crisis has changed the market condition dramatically. So how we respond to the investors' needs, the risk appetite of the investors, taking to those considerations into the project design, into the risk allocation will be critical if we want to move those projects forward. Also make sure that the government needs to think about how they can afford this project from the perspective of fiscal and consumer perspectives. We have seen the government some of the government get into the debt stability issues in the last round of crisis. A lot of it's, government are rushing to the projects without the proper due diligence or project preparations. A lot of the deals have been signed between the government and the government, not taking too long, all kinds of issues, and the media coverage start to uncover some of the negative impact very quickly. So there's a lot of lesson learned from the previous crisis. So also, the government should not only look at what they need now, but also needed to build infrastructure for the futures. And you also mentioned this very important point early on. So we need to look at the trend of the technology changes to make sure the government will incorporate the climate resilience adaptations. Crisis means opportunities for all of us. How do we take the opportunities to make best use of this opportunity? Make sure that we do it appropriately, make sure the government invests in project preparations, make sure those projects are sustainable over the longer term. So let me also, lastly, take the opportunity to share a little bit about our proposal in terms of COVID response. From the GIFT perspective, we have been working hard trying to put together our response package. In the short term, we are trying to put together a $1 million dedicated facility to support some of the projects that are being affected or delayed by the COVID. Try to help the government with additional study that might be needed, additional due diligence, some of the contract renegotiations or repricing, rebalancing, to help them to do additional due diligence, going to the market to get the feedback from private sectors, doing the market soundings, to make sure that the government have adequate feedback from the private sector to help them push this project to the finish line much sooner, so they can start the construction much sooner. In the medium term and the longer term, we're trying to prioritize our support to help state-owned enterprises or utilities that may be under financial stresses due to the COVID crisis, to help them improve the access to the financing, to the capital markets, to help them address some of the liquidity issues, and also help the government to start to develop and design infrastructure investment programs as they look into infrastructure as a stimulus package. Help government to look into the best practice, take on the lesson learned from the previous crisis, as I mentioned, and also help them to address some of the issues that I mentioned earlier. So I'll stop here and look forward to discussing all the details with you and answer any questions that I may have. Back to you, Andy.
Thanks very much for that, Jason. I think you've raised some really important points there about the need for diligence. While there's obviously a big temptation to rush to development, and obviously that's understandable given the need to provide a boost to economies around the world, obviously it's absolutely fundamental to get things right. And that can take time. It doesn't have to take forever, but it can take time, and things need to be done properly. I'm sure we'll return to some of those points in the discussion, but thanks for that contribution. Our next speaker is Solomon Asamoah, who is the Chief Executive of the Ghana Infrastructure Investment Fund. This is a body that's wholly owned by the Republic of Ghana, and its key mandate is to mobilize, manage, coordinate, and provide financial resources for investment in a diversified portfolio of infrastructure projects in Ghana for national development. Solomon is an investment professional with over 25 years of experience executing transactions in both developed and developing markets, and I'm sure is ideally placed to talk to us about this key issue. So over to you, Solomon.
Thank you very much, Andy, and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are, to everybody listening at the moment. Thank you for the invitation to speak today. As mentioned, I'm the CEO of the Ghana Infrastructure Investment Fund, mandated to invest in infrastructure assets in Ghana. I've had previous work as the Vice President of the African Development Bank in charge of infrastructure and former IFC as well. So I've been doing transactions in infrastructure for over 20 years on the Africa continent. Very quickly, what I will cover is firstly just a little bit background of the infrastructure in Ghana and what the institution has been trying to do to develop new infrastructure assets in Africa, some of the challenges, some of the issues, and some of the solutions and some of the successes that we've had. There'll be good lessons for other parts of Africa and other parts of the globe, I'm sure. Then I'll touch upon what the pandemic has meant for us over the last 6 months or so from an African perspective and the issues that it's thrown up. And then I'll try and put the two together and see how we can move forward, particularly in trying to stimulate more infrastructure investment going forward post-pandemic. So the government of Ghana sets up the Ghana Infrastructure Fund, and it's a unique kind of model, very, very, very seldom seen before, where the government has put its money where its mouth is. It put down $325 million in a vehicle and allowed it to be managed to effectively invest and develop infrastructure assets in Ghana. So therefore, for, international investors or foreign investors see an institution that's ready to take some risk on the ground, share the risk with them, and see the returns the same way that they will see the returns. So we give quite a lot of comfort to other investors that the government is committed to doing infrastructure investments in the way that they would normally see them themselves. So over the past 3 years, we've had quite a lot of successes. We have a portfolio now of about 9 investments, including airport, seaport, transportation systems, ICT sector, hospitality and tourism. And for every $1 that GIF has invested so far in these projects, we have raised $10 of other people's money to join us in our investments. So that's quite, I think, a good record. And it speaks to the involvement of private sector and public sector in infrastructure financing. So for our $250 million of investment so far, we've managed to raise over $2 billion from other sources in our transactions. Some of the lessons that we've learned, which are relevant to share. The involvement of the government in infrastructure assets in Africa, most places actually, can't be ignored. It's very difficult to do significant infrastructure assets without a very good relationship with the government. And that means, and also a lot of project preparation and making sure that the projects meet the criteria of the investment community. There's a lot of mismatch between what investors are saying and what government officials are saying. They often use the same words but mean different things. And it also results in some difficulties later on when you're trying to close the transaction. So it's very important that we speak with the same voice, and having a government-owned institutions that's experienced in doing infrastructure projects actually helps both sides and brings them together. So we were running quite well. We had done quite a lot of investments, and we were moving forward and had a nice, healthy pipeline of transactions. And then the COVID hits earlier this year. And what are the consequences of that? Well, fairly quickly, liquidity dries up in a place like Ghana. Commitments of long-term finance that we had seen, or expressions of interest, dried up. And all the focus and all the energy out looking at infrastructure all got sucked into, and correctly so, into the emergency situation of the pandemic. So everybody is now focusing more on addressing the immediate issues of people's life and death situations, which I think is understandable and is the correct thing to do. So our government, which has actually played one of the leading roles, if anybody's been following out of the governments in Africa, our president has been at the forefront. Ghana did a relatively early lockdown. They closed, they locked down and made everybody severe restrictions of movement to try and get a containment around the pandemic. And they were highly successful in that regard, and that we really have relatively low levels of the virus. The government also tied that up with significant testing, particularly in hotspots areas, so they can get a handle of where the likely challenges are to come. But the results of this has obviously had a very significant deteriorating effect on the economy and on the government's finances, because, as you can imagine, economic activity has really reduced. So the government now is moving towards a phased reopening. It has unlocked many of the parts. The airports still remain closed for a little while, but there are plans now with sensible monitoring and keeping ahead of the situation to slowly reopen the economy. The big issue, though, is economic activity and jobs. As most people will realize, in Africa, most of the workers live day to day, get paid daily or weekly. So any period of no economic activity severely hits them, particularly the poor. And so we have to really think about ways of stimulating the economy. The government budget is not as deep as other developed countries, so their remedies for stimulation is a lot more limited. So we look for a lot of assistance from the donor communities and the international agencies. There's a big push to see whether there can be some form of debt relief, because it really does seem very difficult to be servicing all these debts while people are dying, or at least a temporary moratorium. So our government has been looking to the international agencies and the international donors to also share in the burden that's hitting the country at the moment. And we've had some pretty good responses. But clearly we have to get economic activity up and running as soon as the pandemic is under control. And here is where institutions like the Ghana Infrastructure Investment Fund can play a role as sources of liquidity, and also vehicles through which liquidity can pass down so that the continued economic activity can happen in the country. There was a short period of time when construction was stopped. That has now been allowed to resume. We have a number of projects, about 5 of our projects are in construction phase. So now that with social distancing on the work sites, they're allowed to continue with their operations. That's slowly starting to see more economic activity come in. But we have to do it carefully, and we have to do it responsibly to make sure that we keep the pandemic under control. So just like the rest of the world, the Ghanaian government is trying to balance return to normality by keeping the pandemic under control. A few things that I would like to end with, just to set the scene for the way forward. Whilst a lot of attention has been directly on the health issues, institutions like ours are trying to keep a medium-term and a longer-term view so that we can be ready to put funds into the economy and stimulate the economy post-pandemic. And it's very important to realize that investors and financiers will probably be a little bit more conservative for a while. So we have to make sure that our projects are structured correctly. We have to make sure that they're targeted appropriately. And we have to make sure that we provide the necessary time for the projects to finish their construction and go into operations. So I think well-structured projects, long-term financing, support from the DFIs and international communities are all elements of what is going to help us to become a successful rebound when activities open. So I'll stop there, Mr. Moderator, and I'll be available for any questions that may come. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Solomon. I think, again, some really interesting points there. And again, that central point coming across about the need for projects to be properly structured, maybe not, to be rushed. I think what's also quite interesting, what Solomon was saying, was the real success that his organisation has had before the pandemic hit in attracting finance and private finance to some of these key infrastructure projects. And obviously, the hope would be that that would continue going forward. And I think this whole issue around confidence is really important in the sector. We always say that the infrastructure sector is a key sector to help basically revitalize economies. And I think, the confidence and how the sector itself portrays that confidence going forward, I think will be really, really important. Our next speaker is Rebecca Zofnass, who is the managing partner at Environmental Financial Consulting Group. This group is a leading advisor to the architecture, engineering and construction sector, and they provide often data-driven strategic advice to firms in our sector to advance their sustainability and the success of the industry. Rebecca specializes in financial and strategic consulting and valuations work and has a particular expertise in corporate and growth strategy and post-merger integration. This is an organization that knows our sector really well, and I'm sure we'll have some interesting insights to share with us. So over to you, Rebecca.
Great, thank you, Andy. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I am calling in from New York City right now. So we are still on more or less full lockdown, going on about 2 months, but holding in strong. So excited to have the chance to speak with all of you today. Huge thank you, of course, to our moderators and to FIDIC for everything that you do for our industry. What I wanted to talk a little bit about today is kind of coming from the financial vantage point. And the question at hand was talking about the fragility of our sector. And it's an interesting word because I would actually argue, looking at what's happened over the last 25 years, the infrastructure sector is actually fairly resilient, particularly when it comes to what happens in a downturn. So if we take a look at what happened in 2001, 2008, and 2009, we saw median profitability decline by a couple of points and then recover after 3 to 4 years. Growth rates might have slowed, but the median never dropped below 0. So the industry as a whole never really contracted, even during the Great Recession in 08-09. So historically, we've always thought about this industry as recession resilient. And it's part of the reason why there are so many outside investors clamoring to get into the space, ranging from private equity to family offices, even sovereign wealth funds, looking to actually invest in firms. The interesting thing is, about 2 weeks ago, we surveyed close to 200 firms predominantly in North America, including, but also some international firms, and asked them, what are they expecting when it comes to the recovery of this industry? And on the whole, most firms are expecting a slight decline in profitability, a slight decline in revenue growth in 2020, but also expecting it to more or less fully recover by 2021. That is a very, very optimistic vantage point, one that I would not encourage any firm to actually start to align budgets or expectations around. But I will say we have seen that many firms took very, very quick action in response to this, especially when it came to cash management and cost management. So 90% of firms that we surveyed have taken on different levers, pulled different levers to improve their capital position, improve their cash position, ranging from furloughs and layoffs to leadership deferring salaries, deferring share buybacks for employee-owned firms, through different measures to manage working capital by speeding up accounts receivable, delaying payables, really all with the focus on maintaining a really strong cash and cash management position. And this has actually paid off impressively well, because right now, on average, firms have 16% of net revenues in cash, 2 to 3 months of OPEX in cash on hand. That's double where firms were last year. And so I think one of the things that has impressed me and EFCG most is how quickly firms responded financially to make sure that they were set up for success in a downturn. With that said, going back to the projections that 2021 is expected to be a recovery, I think is unrealistic. And part of this comes down to the fact that not only are we dealing with a fairly unprecedented global pandemic and disruption, but this is also going to be a likely recession that is very different from what we've seen in the past. And one of the main reasons for that is geographically, this looks very, very different. Even if I just take a look at the US, even if I just take a look at New York State, where I am, we see very, very different responses, reactions, and therefore likely outcomes. So the ripple effects that we're going to see here in New York City are very different from those that we will see in Houston, Texas, or in Omaha, Nebraska. And that's just talking about the US. It's a very US-centric view. So I think one of the biggest challenges as we talk about the fragility of our sector is not actually the financial fragility. Of course, there are firms that are going to struggle during this, across not just our sector, but all sectors, we're going to see this happen. But the fragility really comes in the fact that historically, the engineering industry is slow to adapt and slow to change. There has been a constant focus on what I would call the tried and true, because that's incredibly important when you're talking about infrastructure projects. But the nature of the current pandemic, I think, will actually require firms to be more willing to quickly adapt and to innovate, ranging from how you're engaging with your employees, how offices are set up, all the way through to how firms are engaging with clients and doing that work. And so I think my main takeaway here is, although the industry is actually fairly recession resilient, the longer term impacts of this are where we are probably going to see real winners and losers, where there are going to be those firms that are willing to quickly adapt, to innovate, to try new ways of doing things, even though that is often counter to a firm's inherent culture. And then I think what we'll find is that those that are not in a position to do so will ultimately be forced to sell or shut down. I think the role of technology here which Jason alluded to in his commentary, I think will be key. The biggest challenge, though, is it's a big question mark. What this looks like, how this will actually happen, how this plays through. And so what I would expect, again, is that we'll start to see perhaps more of a bifurcation among firms, those who are able to innovate and adapt from those who aren't. And therefore, the future of this sector might be those firms that are perhaps more resilient because they are fundamentally more adaptable.
Thanks very much for that, Rebecca. Very, very interesting points, I think, there, particularly about the need for innovation and the effect of the crisis on the sector, where maybe some firms' instincts might be not to go down with business as usual, because I don't think we're going to see that, but certainly to go with the tried and tested, when really actually something else altogether different is actually required. Very important point as well, I think you raised, about the historical resiliency of the sector, which I think we should never forget is a strength of this industry. And I think we will see other industries that maybe aren't so resilient having a tougher time as we come out of the COVID crisis. So thanks for those remarks, and I'm sure we'll dwell on a number of them during the course of the discussion. Our next speaker is Søren Adamsen, who is the Executive Marketing Director at COWI. Now, COWI is a leading international consulting group with offices all over the world, responsible for some of the quite iconic projects on an international basis. They've got 85 years experience in the business, so there's a resilient organization if there ever was one. And with more than nearly 7,500 employees at any given time in the world, they're involved in more than 14,000 projects. So I guess they know a thing or two about resilience and about bankable projects as well. So looking forward to hearing your observations, Søren. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Andy. And thank you very much for the invitation to speak in this event. And a warm good morning here from Copenhagen in Denmark. Denmark is probably one of the countries that has been least hit by the corona pandemic. And it also means that we are one of the countries in a reopening scenario right now. As a sign of that, our national football league, or soccer league, if you will, is reopening tonight. And I guess that's one of the ways we actually are able to benchmark various European countries against each other. As Andy rightly stated, in COWI we are doing business all over the world. However, we are also focused on a few core markets, namely the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, the United Kingdom, and parts of the US and Canadian market in North America. And the input I'll deliver now is very much departing from observations in these markets. Even though Scandinavian markets are some of the markets probably least affected by the coronavirus, we expect the markets to be driven very much by government stimulus packages the next 12 to 18 months. We foresee that traditional private investments will be very defensive in the coming month. The problem is that we do not know in any detail the content of the stimulus packages yet. In order to try to understand the, you could say, anatomy of the crisis, we have worked with a three-level, and we are working with a three-wave model in COWI. First model being very much the first 1 or 2 months after the crisis broke, where we saw a lot of countries coming out with life support packages in reality to the private sector. Second wave, and that is probably where we are right now, is when this life support gradually is being relaxed And the crisis changes from a health crisis to an economic crisis or financial crisis. And the third wave, that is essentially when the economy is kickstarted with the stimulus packages, and in particular when that materializes into projects. And I guess the $50,000 question right now is when that will happen. The second wave of the pandemic, when it turns into the economic crisis, is definitely the way we see it the most vulnerable part. We expect our industry to contract, and we expect to see very, very competitive pricing going on in the coming month. What we also foresee when it comes to kickstarting the economy is very big differences between different markets, based very much on the ability of individual countries to actually finance expansive fiscal policies. What we hope is that we in our core markets will see political negotiations going on over the summer months. We hope to see political agreements in our core markets on the stimulus packages, long-term stimulus packages, coming in the summer month, meaning that we will have something to work with after the summer holidays. However, we don't expect things to be transformed into projects before Q4 and perhaps even more realistically Q1 2021. What we expect to see in Scandinavia, but also in the UK, is a focus on green transformation in the stimulus packages. We believe that many countries in the parts of the world where we mainly are active see green transformation as a driver of growth, basically as a way to develop new solutions that afterwards can be exported to the rest of the world. In that respect, I guess that you could say we are trying to kill two birds with one stone here. I guess as many of our colleagues, we have intensified the dialogue with our clients and our partners during the most recent 2 or 3 months. And just to share a few takeaways with you there, we have had intense dialogue with the last institutional investors in Scandinavia. They are expected to play a key role in the stimulus packages. And large institutional investors here mainly comprises the very big pension funds. Good news is that they are actually positive to chip in with substantial amounts and also to take some risk linked to the kickstart. But again, they are very much focused on long-term investments. And I guess it's back to some of the points being made already here. They are very keen on strong due diligence to be made linked to these projects to be sure that the risk is as limited as it can be. What we have heard from them is a wish to invest in green transformation projects. And I guess that really means 3 things. For sure, it means investing in renewable energy. So I guess that part of the industry will blossom in our part of the world. It means offshore wind farms, it means solar PPV, and it means something like power islands, which is a concept we are working on in the Nordic Rim right now. It could mean transport infrastructure, but I also agree with all of you that the jury is somewhat out here, and we probably need to get a bit of feeling for what how the reaction from people will be, whether they want to use public transport. What I'm pretty sure about is that we will see investments in charging infrastructure for electric cars. And I know in the UK, that's one of the things that's being discussed there right now. Last thing to mention here is buildings. And the building part of our industry is very, very big. And I think we will see a situation where it mainly will be energy renovations that will be in the focus. a last word from my part could be on the developer side. And that very much reflects what we hear from the investors. So developers working with renewable energy are being very active, and we are seeing them as very active right now, and we foresee them to be even more active in the coming months. Whereas the traditional developers working with real estate really are trying to avoid risk right now and are shutting away from investment. I think I'll leave it there for now, Andy, and we'll look forward to the further discussion.
Thanks very much for that, Søren. I think, again, some really interesting points, especially in your closing remarks there about the question of green investment. I mean, there's been a lot of talk, and I know we've had a lot of it in the UK about the prospects for renewable energy. And I think it's almost as if this pandemic, which is obviously, let's not forget, has been a health crisis first and foremost, which has then obviously led to potentially an economic crisis. But I think it's made people think much more about well-being, about the planet, about how we actually care for our resources. And I think it'll be really interesting to see going forward whether or not we will see that big increase in investment in those kind of projects, because on the other hand, there's a possibility, I guess, that governments in their dash for growth will potentially not necessarily put the attention on some of these green projects that they maybe ought to. And obviously, I think we as an industry need, to actually balance that and try and advise them in the correct way, because I suppose, part of having a bankable project is having a project that is actually going to benefit society as a whole as well, and is actually going to get that payback. So I think there's a lot there to cogitate on, I suppose, in the discussion later. But thanks for those initial comments. The final speaker on our panel is Jose Maria Vinales, who is a partner at the international law firm Squire, Patton, Boggs. Jose Maria works in their international trade team, and I think is actually joining us, unless he was stranded when the lockdown happened, from his Madrid office, because I see from his potted biography on his website, he also works in Brussels. So hopefully he wasn't stranded in Brussels, although there's nothing wrong with being stranded in Brussels, of course, not that you could go anywhere at the present moment in time. Jose Maria has a focus on internationalization and has been active in the fields of foreign direct investment and international commerce, as well as project finance also. And more recently, fintech, which again, we've talked about the potential upsurge in technology in the sector going forward. So over to you, Jose Maria.
Well, thank you very much, Andy. I'm now in Madrid, not in Brussels, where I have stayed throughout the lockdown. And good morning, good afternoon to everybody else, and thank you for joining us today. I mean, it was very interesting what the other panelists said, and I'm going to try to complement from my perspective, being a lawyer in an international firm, how my clients, when they are struggling and dealing on a day-to-day basis with the COVID-19 impact, what they do and the type of analysis and next steps they're carrying on. The impact of COVID-19 on global economy is being unfolded as we experience a period of prolonged economic uncertainty. The virus epicenter has shifted from Asia to Europe and now to Latin America, and financial markets have plummeted, and this has affected the infrastructure and construction sector. When my clients, they ask me for advice, pretty much there are 3 different phases where they need advice and where we provide our services. The first one is to identify and evaluate the impact of the crisis in their particular project or their particular company. The second one is try to find the remedies, help them in renegotiating the contracts with third parties, with suppliers, with banks, with the clients, with the countries, with the governments. As well, identify the different stimulus packages and the measures that have been taken in the particular jurisdiction and see how that is going to affect them and how they can benefit from the different loans, subsidies, whatever the country has in place. And the third point is about how to position the company, how to prepare the company for the future. I mean, there is a new reality that is going to be different from what we know and from what has happened until now, and we need to be prepared. And that's where new tech comes in, and that's where the new type of projects in clean energy, for example, sustainable infrastructure, green building, those companies, they need to focus on these different, in these sectors and try to find the best way to survive and to keep track. So among the first three, among the 3 points, the first one, which is identifying and evaluating the impact of the crisis, there are 3 main aspects to take into account. The first one normally happens in ongoing projects. So due to quarantines, lockdowns, travel bans, health and safety restrictions, workers, they cannot get to the projects and they cannot complete the milestones or carry out the works that were scheduled for the project. This has a risk allocation as well, and someone has to be liable for these delays until we find a way to just say that and prove that there has been force majeure or to apply the rebus sic stantibus principles. So that is the first concern. There are delays, there are liabilities because my workers, they cannot get to the site. Another main concern is about the supply chain. There are immense disruptions because products may come from China or machinery, workers may come from another part of the world. So the supply chains, they have been a big issue for a lot of companies. And trying to find other alternative supply chains, it's not an easy task, especially when you have deadlines to fulfill. So there's been a shift from the supply chain principle, which is the just-in-time principle, to a new concept, which is the just-in-case. So what happens if the only provider that I have or supplier is Chinese and China is locked down? I would need to get other machinery or products or whatever from somewhere else in the world. So the whole concept is shifting, and as well the type of contracts that need to be entered into and the type of relation with those providers or suppliers need to be changed. And this affects as well logistics and shipping, insurance, and the rest of the contractual papers. And the third point, besides the supply chain and the works paralyzed for safety reasons, is the cash flow and project finance disruptions. Uncertainty has caused volatility in the financial markets and stock changes that is making financing and capital raising more complex and expensive. This affects particularly short and mid-term projects that are more exposed to the volatility of the exchange rates and project cash flow variations, or projects that fully rely on the market. For example, in Spain, according to the Construction Association, highways have been reduced in their traffic, or have reduced their traffic between 75 and 80% during the days of the week and 90% in the weekend days. So, I mean, we have to deal with all this at the same time. And that leads us to the second point. So the company, they look to a lawyer and they say, okay, so what's next? What can I do? And the lawyer says, well, the first thing I have to do is I need to go through the contracts, do a due diligence and see according to the risks and according to what has happened, if we can renegotiate any contract, or if we can allocate any contractual liability to somebody else, the insurance company, the supplier, the client, the government, if it's a public project. And then we need to do an analysis, which is a very case-to-case and a very specific, taking into account the jurisdiction, about the possibility to apply the force majeure and its consequences, or the rebus sic stantibus principle that would allow us to change the commercial and legal terms of the contracts. But this has to be done taking into account the specific wording of the contracts, but as well the specific jurisdictions that are involved in the project. So, for example, just to give you a clue, I mean, in Spain, in private construction contracts, it is allowed avoidance of liability when unforeseeable events occur and no distribution of risk clause is contained in the agreement. But if these requirements are not met, an evaluation of the applicability of force majeure would be necessary on a case-by-case basis, and I would say very likely would have to be determined by a court. So local force majeure and rebus sic stantibus interpretation by legislation is a must, and COVID-19 pandemic may qualify as either force majeure or rebus sic stantibus under particular contract terms and jurisdictions. In-house and legal counsel shall be effective when evaluating the contractual terms and government measures, and must reach out to existing tools, as for example, the one that FIDIC has available, which is the guidance memorandum to users of FIDIC standard forms of works contracts. So this analysis has to be made, and it's a very tailor-made analysis. And then stimulus packages and measures taken by the governments. I mean, the European Union clearly is going to be injecting money and has granted tax advantages, direct grants, guarantees on loans, subsidies, guarantees on loans channeled through credit institutions, or short-term export credit insurance. But some other countries, they don't have those means, and they don't have the possibility to put all that, all those, resources to restart the projects and get the economy back to normality. So they have just taken regulatory measures to protect their society or protect their economy. And for example, Colombia, has suspended obligations under concession agreements, except for those obligations of operations of transportation infrastructure. Or Mexico only allows activities of conservation, maintenance, and reparation of critical infrastructure. The good news is that the region also prepares the economic packages with a special focus in the development of infrastructure as part of the economic recovery plan. So we can say that Latin America foresees infrastructure project investments as a key area for investment and for restarting the economies, which is good news for the sector. And some other countries like Costa Rica as well, they're looking into concession agreements and PPPs as part of the plan to mitigate the economic impact and attract investors. So once we have identified and evaluated the risks, and then we take into account what the specific country can provide us and the limitations of the specific country and its trends, then we move into the third point, which is, what about the future? Are there any shelter projects, for example? What is this going to be looking in 2021, 2022? So the European Union just yesterday, they issued some clues about their next generation European Union plan. And pretty much what they're saying is that they're going to follow huge investments in those projects that are under the Sustainable Development Goals of United Nations, which are green projects, for example, renewable energy, clean energy projects, cleaner transport and logistics infrastructure, green building, for example, digital infrastructure. So there are shelter projects that are going to benefit from the support of the European Union and the support of other countries. And there are available amounts and financing that is going to be allocated to those projects. So there are many opportunities in that sense. As well in the sector, I understand that as from the COVID-19 crisis, especially European states, they're going to grow the range of services they're going to provide to their citizens in order to avoid other outbreaks or to handle better the situation of future COVID-19 crisis. So it is possible to think that PPPs can be put on the table in some jurisdictions that have traditionally denied and not even want to talk about that type of scheme. And that would join the best of two worlds, because on one hand, you'll be getting the private sector, and on the other hand, the best of the public world. And right now, funds are expected to come from the public sector to reactivate the economy. As well, M&As and concentration in the sector is likely to happen. I mean, companies, they need to get stronger and get a better financial shape, and mergers and acquisitions are there for and would be available to companies to get stronger and bigger. So I think as well, this crisis would bring an opportunity to develop new projects, to find shelter projects, and it's a long-term sector. So if things are done in a reasonable way, the portfolio of projects should be enough to cover the risks of projects that are much more exposed or that have been much more exposed by the crisis. And just to finish, I would like to say that even though the sector is undergoing a delicate moment where uncertainty is a constant, governments and population look up to the infrastructure and construction sector as a driver and economic stimulant in post-COVID times. And back to you, Andy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jose Maria. Again, I think it's really interesting that you finished there on the kind of projects that you thought would be seen as you call them, shelter projects, I suppose, safer havens for investment going forward, because clearly there is going to be some downturn in sections of the economy and in industry sectors. And obviously, you know, what we need to look for there is to actually ensure that that's actually made, well, firstly, that there isn't as much, we can reduce the propensity for a downturn, but also that we actually make up that, you know, from other project sectors. So I think, again, the green development issue has come into the fore, and I think it will be really interesting to see how that actually how that pans out going forward. Just before we take questions, you know, from the floor, I just want to ask, you know, the panel sort of collectively on that. You know, a couple of you mentioned those projects that you thought would be very popular going forward. I mean, other than the green infrastructure projects, what other projects do you think you know, investors would look at and think, well, actually these are bankable projects, notwithstanding the current crisis that we might have been in? You know, we will actually look at these projects as quite, you know, much more bankable. If I could, you know, potentially turn to Rebecca to sort of add her view on that. Well, you know, what are your thoughts on that, Rebecca?
So I will certainly echo the many panelists who shared that I think sustainable infrastructure is going to be key going forward. I will also say, though, that when we look across different client bases, I think firms that are predominantly working with federal governments are probably going to be more protected than those who are working with private clients. I think state municipalities is still, that's kind of the the open question on what that will look like, and that really is where it's going to be geographically dependent. But certainly looking ahead, I would say probably the greatest confidence still lies in federal clients at this point.
Anyone else want to pick that up? Søren, do you have any thoughts on that? Where you think, you know, some of those, you know, more bankable projects are going to be coming from?
Well, I first of all, I agree very much with Rebecca's points. In addition to that, I think what this crisis has shown us is essentially that that we are able to work from home, and that we can make a society work based on working from home. And evidently that is good news for some sectors and bad news from other sectors. I wouldn't want to be the one who's building big time office blocks right now. I think that's a dangerous market to be in. On the other hand, having huge contracts for the IT tech giants might be interesting right now. So I think everything that underpins the IT sector, that underpins the fact that we're able to work from home and have well, basically a working relationship from home, is going to be one of the lessons we take forward. So investments in, say, data centers, storage facilities for data, anything that basically means that we're able to communicate as efficiently as we do right now, is something I think will be even more important after the crisis.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm just scrolling my way through the many questions that our attendees are putting forward, and I'm just going to pull out a couple of them, and I'm going, if I may, to Jason. Partly flowing from what Søren's just said, do you think that there's going to be any change in the business models of clients and developers as a result of what we've seen with this pandemic and the potential economic crisis that could ensue as a result? What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Thank you, Andy. I think the impact of the COVID on different subsector, we call that, is very different. The previous speaker all kind of alluded to that already. You know, infrastructure is a general term. I mean, if you break down to energy, to transportations, to water sanitations, to ICT, the impact is, of course, is very different. So when the investor look at that, you know, what's the exposure to those industries? You know, they have to, you know, to think through that, even within the transportation, for example, right? The public transportations, the roads, the airport, the impact of COVID could be very different. Ultimately, where you want to focus on, I think, in the end, is just look at how the demand is going to be affected, and what is the source of the revenue and the quality of the revenues. Rebecca mentioned, you know, the federal government type of contract or works is going to be probably more desirable, but ultimately that's the quality of the revenue, you know, reliability of the cash flow going to be, right? So also you look into the project economics, the supply demand, and look at these the fundamental issues. When you go into the emerging market, it's the usual things that we're looking at, the regulatory environment, the rule of law, the government track record of political commitment from the government, and the risk allocations, the risk reward appetite going to be very different going forward. In the road project, for example, previously prior to the crisis, there was some risk appetite from private sector taking the traffic risk, for example. Going forward, this is the kind of a shift in the dynamic dramatically for a lot of the investors. So how the concession will be structured, right? People are probably more looking to, some kind of availability payment, less risk appetite or interest in taking the demand risk of the traffic risk, for example. Looking to some kind of credit enhancement potentially, government guarantees at different levels. Looking to the multilateral development bank involved in some of these projects to help with the credit enhancement. So those are the things that the investor will be looking to going forward. So it's difficult to generalize to just say infrastructure in one sector. There are so many dimensions, right? When it comes to different subsectors and how the deals are structured and how that link to the fundamental of the project economics in the end. Yeah.
Thanks for that. Really interesting question, actually, particularly bear in mind that I think it was Jose Maria who Søren, I can't remember who said it now, who basically made the point that there was going to be a lot of competitive pricing taking place in the industry going forward. Because we've got a really good question from Srivastava Gopinath, who said, a question for everyone on the panel, and I don't expect everyone to answer it. I'm going to pick someone out. As a result of disruption in the supply chain, what do we think is actually going to happen as far as that's concerned? I mean, Solomon, are construction costs going to go up as a result of the current crisis? If you could
flickered at the first.
Okay, we can hear you now.
Yeah, you flickered at the first part of your question, so I didn't hear it. But the last part was, do I think construction costs will go up?
That's it.
Yeah. Okay. I think probably. I think it depends on how the funding has been structured, and it also depends on conditions on the ground. I would say that in Ghana, and this links to another question which I saw was asked to me, was how do we manage things on the ground in terms of getting people infected? One of the things about Ghana, which you'll notice if you come around, is that there is a lot of mask wearing and there's a lot of social distancing on construction sites is mandatory at the moment, and it's very high on the thoughts of a lot of people, much more than people expected to be observed. Still not 100%, but still quite significantly. So I think on the sense of that, being able to keep people safe and to keep people away from catching the pandemic, I think some good interventions have been taken already. But there's also the other side of things, which is as I mentioned, many people get paid weekly or daily. As jobs become more difficult, unfortunately, maybe the labor costs will actually come down in some cases. The cost of doing the business will maybe come down. But I think the issue really goes more to the financing structure that you've been able to put in place for your project. If you have long-term committed funding that can ride out some of these short changes, then I think you'll be okay. Bigger challenges for us at the moment are the airports locked down, and tourism and the hospitality sectors have really been affected at the moment, with occupant rates in hotels down to single digits at the moment. We expect a rebound when the airports open, but it has been a significant turn down. One final thing that I think I need to stress, which I think is extremely important, is that we actually haven't seen the levels of deaths or the level of sicknesses that many people predicted so far, touch wood, in Ghana, in Africa at the moment, particularly in our area. So, for example, there's nobody in the country on a ventilator, I believe, at the moment. Our hospitals are not seeing people dying in the numbers in other parts of the world. Maybe that could be due to something inherent in the African environment, although we're not relying upon that. But at the moment, we're trying to keep a hold on that. I think there was another question. Should I try and address it, or should I?
No, I'll come back to that because
Okay.
we just can't address them all. It's impossible. Just to say to everybody on the webinar that we will have a recording of the webinar available probably within an hour of this event. You'll be able to get that link from the FIDIC website, So you'll be able to sort of, muse on some of the questions that have been raised as well. But one thing that's came out in the discussion, and that is the role of technology and innovation going forward. And a couple of people have asked that question. I'd like just to address it in the first instance to Rebecca. How much of a role do you think that will play in those firms that you talked about earlier, those innovative firms that were going to be, almost the future of the industry?
Yeah, it's certainly a great question, and perhaps unsurprisingly, one that doesn't have a clear-cut answer just yet. And part of that's just fundamentally driven by the fact that technology can mean many different things to many different people. And unfortunately, a firm can say, we are a technology-enabled engineering firm. We are focused on technology, and they might be talking about what I would call internal technology. Communication, collaboration, ERP, CRM, things like that just make you more efficient. And to be clear, that piece is critical, especially right now, but it probably will continue to be critical as we continue to work in as we shift probably more towards a more remote workforce. When I'm talking about technology, though, as helping to delineate between those firms who really kind of not just survive but actually thrive as a result of this pandemic and the potential downturn that will come from it, I'm thinking more about technology that fundamentally provides another revenue stream and actually enables a firm to diversify its revenue base. One of the most consistent things that we've seen is those firms who have a diversified revenue base tend to do better in a downturn, protects against that downside. And so what I would anticipate is those firms who are thinking about technology in the context of how can we not just improve efficiency and improve our value proposition, but how can we actually create products and services, software as a service, platform as a service, that we can sell not just to our clients, but even to our competitors. That's where I think we'll see those firms who find themselves far more protected against some of the other challenges that the industry will face.
Thanks for that, Rebecca. Very interesting questions being posed from someone in the chat. And I think this speaks to this whole question of, what kind of infrastructure is actually going to be, more bankable, more used going forward, because someone's reminded us that there are 2 billion people in Africa and in some parts of Asia that need houses, that need infrastructure. So I suppose built infrastructure, and COVID hasn't changed that situation for them. How do we ensure that they're not forgotten about? How do we ensure that the investment actually goes in and this recovery isn't just seen as, one for, green tech, or can it be both? I think, Solomon definitely would have a view on that issue. Solomon.
Yes, quickly.
I'm going to bring Bill in next as well, because he mentioned in his introductory remarks about these challenges that the world faces still haven't gone away. But Solomon, you first.
Yes, and I think Africa is in a different position than many other parts of the world facing this, because a lot of the basic infrastructure is not in place. And I've often said before that sometimes it seems a little bit unfair, whereas most other countries, most of the basic infrastructure was put in by the public sector. Africa is often being asked to put basic infrastructure through the private sector. And as we know, that's a much more challenging structures to put in place to try and address those. However, it does offer also an opportunity, so-called technology jumps, where you can miss out elements and use more technology and later ways of solving problems. So the issue of technology and digitization and using tech platforms, particularly for trading platforms, particularly for constructing, closing transactions without having physically to move to different places, I think it's an area that a lot of focus has been taking place in Africa. So technology, digitization, using platforms, which then leads to the other point that somebody made about the ICT sector. Again, I think there's going to be a lot of investment looking at this particular area because the real challenge in Africa is not so much voice communication. In fact, in many respects, voice communication is more advanced in Africa than other parts of the world. The real challenge is the cost of broadband and the cost of internet connectivity, which is high still. And so with the increase of Zoom technology, for example, there's going to be a lot more investment necessary in the ICT sector. We're all seeing signs of that already. We've invested in laying over 1,000 kilometers of fiber across Africa. And we see data centers and other areas as another area of potential investment in Africa. But it's very important that, which is why we say the international communities and the donor communities mustn't forget about providing funding for Africa, or else the pandemic will take a hold there and it will then move to the rest of the world.
Bill, just come in briefly on that, because I am going to bring you back in at the end to wrap up, but I just want to try and get to some of the other questions, because there's some absolute corkers amongst them.
Well, I'll try to be very brief, Andy, which is always a challenge after listening to all these great ideas. But I believe that we as a profession, in addition, of course, to FIDIC, need to do everything we can to keep reminding decision makers of the need to do much more with all of the infrastructure challenges that we have, including those that will result from the pandemic. Some have already existed, some are going to change, and FIDIC intends to do some things on that, which I might mention at the end of my remarks. The other thing I'd say related to infrastructure is one of the mechanisms to get more bang for the buck with infrastructure is to do things more cost effectively. And the engineering profession can be incredibly innovative when we feel free to innovate. And with the new tools of working remotely and with information technology, data management, robotics, all of those things, I think there is enormous potential for us to reduce the cost of infrastructure so we can get more of it done. So I'll turn it back to you, Andy, and I'll come back in towards the end, okay?
That's great, Bill. Thanks for that. Another question I want to ask to all the panelists, but I want a very brief reply, even a sentence. It's interesting, Rebecca's comments about the 2021 being a bit optimistic, and I think that she also used the word unrealistic for a recovery in the construction sector. Number of people have asked, okay, so when do you think the sector will, if you like, bounce back to its previous level? And what do we think, any downturn might look like? People talk about V shape, U shape, L shape. Very briefly, each of you in turn, when do you think we might bounce back completely? And what are we looking at going forward? Jose Maria.
Well, I mean, I think it really depends on the area, and it really depends on the jurisdiction. But I would say that it's more going to be the recovery like the logo of Nike, like a tick, right, more than a U or a V. That's
so hopefully people will just do it then, on the basis of that when it comes to recovery. Søren, what's your view on that?
Sorry, I just needed to unmute. To do it very, very fast. U-shaped 2022.
Okay, Solomon, over to you.
When there's a vaccine.
Excellent answer. I don't know whether Jason's still there. He's on mute, but I'm just thinking he might well have. Yes, he's here. Jason, your thoughts very, very briefly on the answer to that question.
The safe answer probably depends. It depends on the jurisdictions, and we see some part of the world like China already start to see the recovery, and it depends on how the government acts and how the people react to these things. And of course, also agree with Solomon. Ultimately, the vaccine. So yeah, it's hard to say. Definitely the answer for the 2021.
Thanks a lot. I'm going to obviously throw that one over to Rebecca, because it was her initial remarks that sparked that question from a number of the attendees in the chat box. Rebecca, your thoughts on that?
I agree with Jose Maria. I think it's going to be a Nike swoosh, and I would guess it's going to be 2023 before we get to 2019 levels.
Okay, well, thanks for that. Again, as always, we've not been able to address all the questions within the chat box. There's been some really fascinating ones about some micro detail on some of the FIDIC contracts, which again I see that my colleague Barbara answered them as some of those questions in the chat, signposting FIDIC's COVID-19 page on our website, and also the many guidance documents, including some that touch on the issue of force majeure, which has been mentioned by a number of people in the chat. The other thing to bear in mind as well is that next week's seminar, which we have now moved to Wednesday at the same time, is going to be looking at what is the new normal for construction, which is a massive subject, but one that I think, you know, there is massive interest in our sector. You know, after this crisis, just what is that new normal going to look like? We're going to be, you know, chewing that subject with another tip-top panel next Wednesday. But just before, you know, I you know, give my closing remarks, I just want to bring FIDIC President Bill Howard back into the discussion just to round things off and give his observations on the webinar and a few closing remarks. Over to you, Bill.
Thank you very much, Andy, and thank you enormously to all the speakers for an incredibly informative session, and for the questioners. We've got terrific questions, a number of them. Just a few remarks I would like to make is based on the experience of our firms in many economic downfalls over the last 40 or 50 years. There's almost always been a lag between between the economic crisis, and I know we're in a health crisis now, but we have economics as well. There's generally a lag between the time the crisis hits and the full impact to our firms. And so I think I totally agree that the years 2021, 22, 23 are going to potentially be a challenge. The other thing I'd like to comment about is that Jason mentioned right at the beginning of the webinar on spending the right amount of time to identify the right projects so that they're done right. That requires planning and the right level of engineering professional input into the beginning of a project. And when you're in a financial crisis where fees might be overly negotiated, for lack of a better description, sometimes there's a great temptation to jump right over the planning phase or do it a little bit less rigorously. And unfortunately, that can lead to significant problems. The other things we've heard about that we heard in the other webinars is uncertainty, the need for scenario planning, the opportunities created by this crisis, some of which have been existing and some of which are new. And in that connection, as I mentioned, FIDIC is very committed to communicating with decision makers about the need for infrastructure investment. And after these webinars, you will be seeing some materials coming out from FIDIC over the next year or so on the state of the world related to infrastructure, the need for investment, and the need to address climate change, sustainable development, et cetera. So lots of activities going on. And then that final comment I'd make is we are certainly very receptive to any suggestions in terms of what other things that we should be emphasizing in the state of the world. So back to you, Andy. I tried to be as brief as possible.
Thanks very much, Bill, for being brief. And we're now down to the last 2 minutes of the webinar, so we're on time and on budget, as they say. Just to reflect what Bill said, tons of stuff coming out from FIDIC over the coming weeks. FIDIC's already published quite a lot of material to help the industry respond to the to the current crisis, and that process, as I said earlier, continues next week with the next webinar in our series, which I think has the potential to be, dare I say it, potentially the best webinar that we've organised yet. You know, looking at what is the new normal, both for construction and for society as we move forward post COVID. So that's next Wednesday at 12 noon Central European time. If you've not registered for that webinar yet, then make sure that you go on the FIDIC website and register so that you secure your place for next week. All I want to do, just in wrapping things up, is to thank my fantastic panel, Rebecca, Søren, Solomon, Jose Maria, Jason, and also Bill for their insights. And I think what's been a very, very interesting webinar. All of the points that were made in the chat, many of which we couldn't get to, we will address those in the material that we produce going forward. And it's really important feedback for FIDIC. So we thank all of the participants for that. And just finally, last but not least, to thank Barbara for her work behind the scenes in organising the event and making everything run smoothly. So thanks very much for your attendance today, and we hope to see you all again on Wednesday, 12 noon CET. Thanks a lot, guys.